At the beginning of the 20th century, a book fell into the hands of the Polish antiquarian Wilfrid Voynich, which immediately stood out from all the manuscripts known to him. It was written in an incomprehensible language, decorated with illustrations of unknown plants, bizarre symbols, astronomical schemes, and naked female figures in strange tanks. At first glance, it was a typical alchemical treatise of the Middle Ages. But no language, no alphabet, no scientific or esoteric tradition could give a clear explanation of the contents of this book. More than 100 years have passed since the discovery of the manuscript, and to this day no one in the world has been able to decipher it. Neither scientists, nor cryptographers, nor the military, nor artificial intelligence algorithms. The Voynich Manuscript is today considered the most mysterious text in history. It is kept in the Beinecke Rare Book Library at Yale University under the number MS408 and remains the subject of study, debate, and theories, from scientific to fantastic. Some consider it a brilliant hoax, others, the key to lost ancient knowledge, others, the product of the encrypted thinking of a person who suffered a mental disorder. But one thing remains unchanged. No one knows what exactly is written on its pages. The story of the manuscript's appearance in the public domain begins in 1912, when Voynich, an antiquarian with a reputation as a collector of rare and valuable manuscripts, visits the Villa Mondragone in Frascati, near Rome. Here, among the property of the former Jesuit college, he discovers a mysterious book. It consists of 240 pages of parchment, written in a neat, but completely unfamiliar handwriting. Some pages contain carefully drawn illustrations of plants, star charts, circles reminiscent of alchemical symbols, and female figures depicted in baths, pipes, capsules, or tanks of liquids. Wilfrid was astounded. As a classically educated man, he knew many languages, including Latin, Greek, Polish, English, and Italian. But the language of this manuscript was completely alien. In fact, even the letters themselves had no equivalent in any known alphabet. Despite this, the text was too structured to be a random collection of symbols. It did not look like hallucinations or delirium. The manuscript had an internal logic, paragraphs, repeating structures, sections, and stylistic design. All of this indicated that the author knew what he was writing and did so intentionally and deliberately. Voynich quickly realized that he had discovered something truly unique. He bought the manuscript and brought it to London, where he began his own investigation, trying to understand the book's origins. Inside the manuscript, he found a sheet with the supposed signature of Jacobus de Tepanek, the court alchemist of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II. This discovery suggested that the manuscript could have been in the imperial collection in Prague at the end of the 16th century. Historians later confirmed that Rudolph was indeed an avid collector of esoteric texts and could well have paid a lot of money for such a rarity. According to one of the early hypotheses, it was Rudolph II who acquired the manuscript from the English alchemist John Dee or his partner Edward Kelly. Dee was known as a man who contacted angels, practiced esoteric forms of knowledge, and owned an extensive library. However, there is no mention of such a manuscript in his notes, although the very fact of his presence in Prague makes this version plausible. However, there is no documentary evidence linking John Dee to this text. After Voynich's death in 1930, the manuscript passed to his widow, Ethel Voynich, a writer and daughter of the famous mathematician George Boole. Later, the book fell into the hands of the American antiquarian Hans Krauss, who donated it to Yale University in 1969. It was from this moment that the manuscript became available to a wide range of scientists, linguists, and cryptographers. That at first glance, the contents of the manuscript are divided into several conventional sections. The first is botanical. It depicts dozens of plants, and none of them match known biological species. Some parts resemble real plants, but overall they look like hybrids or fantasies. Scientists have tried to find matches in European, Asian, and Middle Eastern flora, but to no avail. A hypothesis has emerged that these are not real plants at all, but symbolic images, possibly alchemical or metaphysical. The second section is astronomical. Here you can find diagrams with solar and lunar cycles, zodiac circles, constellations. Some images vaguely resemble real astronomical maps, but most of the symbols remain undecipherable. In the center of the circle, there may be figures resembling human ones, as if reflecting the influence of the stars on the body or soul. The third section is biological, or, as it is also called, anatomical. It is here that numerous female figures are depicted, often naked, with unusual tubes connecting various vessels, reservoirs, capsules. Some researchers believe that this may be a symbolic description of the reproductive system, female physiology, or the birth process. But the images are too strange to be purely medical. They seem to be intertwined with esotericism and symbolism. The fourth section is considered pharmaceutical. It depicts vessels, bottles, flasks, plant roots. Here, the text is denser, with fewer illustrations. Perhaps this section contains recipes, descriptions of the properties of substances, or instructions for preparing potions. Finally, the last section is text, almost without illustrations, with dense and uniform writing. Perhaps this is a summary of the previous parts or a separate treatise. But the language in which all this is written remains an unsolved mystery. Attempts to decipher the manuscript began almost immediately after its publication. In the 1910s, 1930s, famous cryptographers joined the work, including William Newbold, who mistakenly believed that the text was written in Latin, encoded using microscopic symbols. Later, in the 20th century, World War II led to the fact that specialists who had broken Nazi codes became interested in deciphering it, including William Friedman, one of the leading cryptanalysts in the United States. But even he admitted that the language of the manuscript could not be deciphered using standard methods. Today, the Voynich Manuscript has been digitized and is freely available. Anyone can download it and try to solve the mystery on their own. This has given rise to an entire subculture of online investigators, bloggers, enthusiasts, and programmers creating algorithms for analyzing the structure of the text. However, none of the versions has withstood serious scientific criticism. Against this background, a logical question arises. Is there any meaning in this text at all? Or is it simply cleverly imitated nonsense, designed to mislead? And if so, why? And who could have such exceptional skill in forging text, structure, language, illustrations, and logic? Interest in the Voynich manuscript has not waned since its appearance. However, a special wave of attempts to decipher it was caused by the technological progress of the 20th century and the participation of professional cryptographers. The most ambitious attempts came in the post-war period, when analysts capable of deciphering the codes of Nazi Germany and Japan came onto the scene. One of the most famous figures was William Friedman, a man who played a key role in American cryptanalysis. During World War II, his team devoted many years to deciphering the Voynich. But even they were unable to find a clear structure characteristic of known ciphers. Friedman hypothesized that the text was written in an artificial language, perhaps using a polygraphic cipher, where each symbol encodes certain syllables or parts of words. He tried to apply frequency analysis methods, but found that the distribution of symbols in the text did not match the distribution of any known language. This gave rise to the assumption that this was not just a cipher, but something much more complex, perhaps a logically constructed system devoid of the grammatical structure we are accustomed to. Other researchers, including linguists and semioticians, also tried to approach the text from a scientific point of view. Some noted that the manuscript exhibited a phenomenon called chain structure, the repetition of words with minor variations, which could indicate an agglutinative language or even synthetically created speech. There were even those who claimed that the text was written on some intuitive level, as if it were a stream of consciousness of a person with a unique worldview. The statistics were of particular interest. Despite the fact that the symbols had no known meaning, the structure of the text showed surprising linguistic stability. The number of repeated words, the distances between them, the logic of paragraphs, and even the supposed punctuation corresponded to living languages and not to random generation. This cast doubt on the hoax theory. It is too difficult to imitate such a stable structure without computers and advanced algorithms. At the same time, the text itself seems not just a meaningless set of characters, but a carefully thought-out system. Since the 2000s, machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence have joined the research. One of the first such studies was conducted by Canadian scientists who trained a neural network to recognize patterns based on known languages. They came to the conclusion that the Voynich manuscript was most likely written in a real, but lost language, with a unique structure and morphology. However, at this stage, the research reached a dead end. It is impossible to decipher the language without having a translation of at least one fragment of the text. Among the most famous hypotheses, it is worth highlighting an attempt to compare the text with ancient languages, including medieval Latin, Armenian, Old Church Slavonic, even Chinese, and Tibetan. None of the versions were confirmed. The work of Canadian Stephen Bax, who proposed a method of comparative visual analysis, was interesting but controversial. He suggested that it was possible to find a correspondence between the images of plants and their names in Old Persian, and thus begin deciphering. However, his hypothesis was subjected to serious criticism and was not widely accepted. No less sensational was the study of 2019, in which, using Google neural networks, scientists said that they had found a correspondence between the structure of the text and Hebrew. According to their version, the language of the text is Hebrew, written in a modified form. However, the study did not stand up to linguistic analysis. The machine translation turned out to be forced, and the sentence structure was artificial. Critics said that the algorithm simply adjusted the translation to known words, without taking into account the context and grammar. In parallel with this, hypotheses appeared claiming that the text does not make sense at all. One of the most famous supporters of this version is Gordon Rugg from the University of Kiel. He suggested that the text could have been created using a simple mechanical device similar to Cardano's grid, a table with slots through which letters are inserted. In this way, the author could create structured but meaningless text that imitated language. This theory explains the stability of symbols and repetitive structures, but it does not answer the main question: why? If the manuscript is indeed a hoax, it must have had a specific purpose: to sell it to a wealthy collector, to mislead the scientific community, or even to confuse political opponents. However, none of these purposes are documented. Moreover, the Voynich manuscript is too complex and detailed to be a simple forgery. It contains hundreds of illustrations, a logical structure, pages arranged according to a specific plan. This does not look like a cheap hoax in an attempt to find at least a time frame. Scientists conducted radiocarbon dating of the parchment in 2009. The results showed that the material was made between 1404 and 1438. This confirmed that the manuscript was created in the 15th century, long before Voynich was born and Rudolph II appeared. Interestingly, the ink used in the text and illustrations corresponds to the technology of that time. This means that the manuscript is indeed a product of the late Middle Ages and not a modern forgery. However, despite the precise dating, this discovery did not add to the understanding of the meaning of the text. It only confirmed its authenticity in chronological terms. Moreover, the absence of stylistic and substantive analogues makes the manuscript unique. No other 15th-century manuscript contains such language, such symbols, or such a style of illustrations. Modern technologies have made it possible to conduct a physico-chemical analysis of the ink, pigments, and parchment. Research has shown that all components correspond to regions of Central Europe, including the Czech Republic, northern Italy, and southern Germany. This gave reason to assume that the manuscript was created in this area, but who exactly was its author is unknown. Not a single match in handwriting, style, themes, or structure was found. Some theories suggest that the manuscript could have been a personal project of a person suffering from schizophrenia or another mental disorder. This version explains the complexity of the structure, the obsession with details, the symbolism, and the simultaneous lack of a logically connected text. However, upon closer analysis, a paradox arises. For a person with a serious mental disorder, the manuscript is too ordered, structured, and aesthetically harmonious. In addition, it was clearly created over a long period of time, with strict control over the composition, scale, and logic of the illustrations. Psycholinguists have tried to approach the text from the point of view of cognitive models. Some have claimed that the manuscript could have been written in an altered state of consciousness, under the influence of hallucinogens, during trance practices, or using automatic writing, which was popular among mystics of the early 20th century. However, dating it to the 15th century refutes such hypotheses as primary. Among the most extravagant versions are assumptions about the extraterrestrial origin of the text, contacts with extraterrestrial civilizations, Atlantis codes, and even time travel. These ideas, although popular in mass culture, do not find support in the scientific community, since they are not based on facts and verifiable data. One of the most balanced assumptions is that the Voynich manuscript could have been an attempt to create a universal philosophical and natural language, a kind of analog of the linguistic projects that appeared in Europe in the 17th to 18th centuries. Such a language had to be free from ambiguity, logical, and universal. Perhaps the author tried to construct a new way of transmitting knowledge, combining text, symbols, and illustrations. But why this idea arose so early, in the 15th century, remains a mystery. Despite its apparent chaos, the structure of the Voynich manuscript demonstrates a striking pattern that has puzzled researchers for decades. From the first pages, it seems that we are looking at a systematically organized text. Each chapter has repeating patterns, stable constructions, and regular transitions between topics. Even the length of words and their positioning within lines follow certain rhythms. These features indicate that the text obeys internal grammatical rules, albeit unknown. In an attempt to approach the mystery from the linguistic side, enthusiasts and scientists turned to frequency analysis. It turned out that certain symbols are most frequently encountered in the manuscript, and their combinations obey laws close to Zipf's law, which describes the distribution of words in natural languages. According to this law, the most frequently used word in a language occurs approximately twice as often as the second most frequently used word, and so on. Surprisingly, the Voynich structure also obeys this law. This is an important argument in favor of the fact that the text is not a random set of symbols. However, there are also oddities. For example, the manuscript almost completely lacks words of one symbol, and there are very few long words, more than 10 symbols. Most words consist of 5 to 8 symbols. This is in sharp contrast to European languages, where the length of words fluctuates much more. In addition, the manuscript often contains similar words, differing by one symbol or repeating with small variations. This behavior is more typical of artificially constructed languages than of natural ones. Another feature is the so-called context blocks. Within one page, certain words or symbols are used more often than in other places. This may mean that each page is devoted to a specific topic or section of knowledge, even if we do not understand the essence of these topics. Such local frequency is observed, for example, in encyclopedias or treatises, where each chapter describes different phenomena. This may indicate that the manuscript is encyclopedic in nature, a description of concepts, substances, processes. Text analysis also showed that the beginning of lines often contains certain symbols, which may indicate the presence of punctuation, markers, or grammatical constructions. Some researchers suggest that the first symbols in lines play the role of grammatical particles, analogues of articles, prepositions, or conjunctions. This strengthens the hypothesis of the presence of grammar in the text, albeit incomprehensible to us. The so-called Halin diagrams found in the astronomical section deserve special attention. These circular images contain concentric rings connected by lines, interspersed with unknown symbols and images resembling the phases of the moon. Some researchers believe that this may be a form of calendar based on lunar cycles. Interestingly, some circles depict female figures inscribed in geometric shapes, which gives rise to associations with alchemical symbolism or even with the representation of human anatomy in astrological contexts. There is a suggestion that the manuscript reflects the idea of the connection between the cosmos, the body, and nature, a kind of esoteric model of the world, where planets, herbs, liquids, and man are connected by invisible threads. This brings the manuscript closer to the Gnostic or Hermetic traditions, especially characteristic of the late Middle Ages. However, the lack of textual interpretation makes any such hypothesis only a guess. Some elements of the manuscript's iconography are also surprisingly consistent. For example, the plants, although they do not correspond to known species, have anatomical logic. They have roots, stems, leaves, fruits. This is not just fantasy. It seems that the author observed real objects and transformed them in accordance with his own system. Such a methodology is typical, for example, of alchemists who imagine plants as embodiments of principles or elements, and not as botanical units that in the pharmaceutical section, where vessels, flasks, and roots are depicted. A logical sequence appears. Next to each vessel is an image of a plant or its part. Some researchers believe that we are talking about medicinal compositions. Perhaps we are dealing with an ancient pharmacopoeia encrypted by the author to protect knowledge. This approach took place in history. Alchemists often used distorted symbols, abbreviations, and their own languages to protect their recipes from profane people or competitors. However, even if we assume that the manuscript is a pharmacological or alchemical treatise, the question remains, why does not a single symbol have analogues in the known ciphers of that time? Why in this case was not at least partially Latin, Greek, or Arabic terminology used? As was customary in the scientific literature of the era, there is no answer. A separate line of research concerns the visual structure of the page. Some enthusiasts suggest that the arrangement of text and images may not be random. For example, on the pages with bathing women, the lines of text wrap around the illustrations, sometimes even incorporating them. This may mean that the text and the image work as a single whole, a kind of code that can only be deciphered as a whole. Such a structure could be the basis of a visual language, where symbols acquire meaning only in the context of form and arrangement. Against this background, the theory of multiple levels of encryption is of interest. According to it, a manuscript can contain several layers of information. One is superficial, visual, the second is textual, and the third is structural. Thus, to understand the text, one must take into account not only the symbols, but also their position, quantity, and visual design. This makes deciphering almost impossible without knowing the original key. Among the most intriguing observations is the regular repetition of certain roots in words. Many words are constructed according to the type, prefix plus root plus suffix, where the prefix and suffix vary and the root remains unchanged. This again points to a possible morphological structure of the language, albeit artificially created. Some researchers have tried to compile dictionaries of these roots, but without success. Without a parallel text in a known language, this is a dead end. There are also hypotheses that the manuscript could have been written by several people at once. However, handwriting analysis refutes this. Almost the entire text was written by one hand, with the same pressure, tilt, rhythm. This gives reason to believe that the author was alone, worked consistently, perhaps for many years. His handwriting was stable, confident, and developed, which also indicates high literacy and experience. The illustrations, despite their strangeness, were also written, apparently, by one person. The color scheme is stable, the strokes and outlines are the same, the lines are confident. The entire manuscript looks like the result of a holistic idea and not a collection of different sources. This, in turn, makes the version of a hoax even less likely. The volume and labor intensity of the work is too great. It is also worth paying attention to the physical features of the book. The binding was added later, but the parchment pages themselves are original. Some of them were cut out or lost, which may indicate the existence of additional sections or secret fragments that were removed. But by whom and why is unknown. There are even suggestions that some pages were destroyed by the author himself to preserve the secret. It is impossible, not to mention the presence of small details that escape the eye at a cursory glance. In some images, especially in astronomical schemes, you can notice miniature inclusions reminiscent of the symbolism used in alchemical or Gnostic texts. They are too small to be accidental. This may be part of a code, a hidden clue, or even a system for navigating the text, taking into account all these features. Many modern researchers come to the conclusion that the Voynich manuscript is not just a text, but a complex system of knowledge transfer, perhaps on the border between language, art, and cipher. It could have been intended for a narrow circle of initiates, for one student, or even for the author himself, as a way to record a personal system of worldview that was inaccessible to others.